Thank you all very much for coming to my talk. I'm very pleased to share my work with new colleagues here in Helsinki. And I really look forward to your feedback, to your comments, because this is something, the talk is based on a paper that I'm still working on for publication. So if any improvements can be suggested, please make them. This paper is not really part of the project that I'm working on while here in Helsinki, but it is very representative of my research interests and the work I do more generally. I think I've mentioned to a few of you already that I am a historical sociologist and I'm a political sociologist, and more specifically, I'm interested in collective behavior and political culture. I'm also I do social theory, and so you'll see it very prominently in this paper. And actually, when I think about this paper, this is not really a paper about Russia or paper about social movements, but it is a theory-building paper. So the research that I'm going to be doing while I'm here in Helsinki focuses on changes in political culture during Perestroika in Russia. And this paper looks at the effect of recent political mobilizations on political culture. So political culture is the unifying sort of angle of my work. Most commonly, scholars of collective behavior measure successes of political mobilizations in terms of regime change or institutional change or at least policy change. But these are not the only effects or not only possible consequences of political mobilizations. And in this paper that I said I'm working on for publication, I explore some of the effects of political mobilizations on political culture. And I do it on the example of protests in Russia, the so-called movement for fair elections or anti-fraud protests in 2011-2012. The problem of political culture has been a very important research topic for scholars of Russia since the country's departure from state socialism. For example, return to authoritarianism, whether it happened after 2000 under President Putin or whether it happened before that, is often connected to Russian citizens' general apathy and civic indifference. But according to several recent studies, while non-voting political activity has been on decline since its peak during the late Soviet period, Russian citizens do have certain civic skills, very developed civic skills. For example, they're pretty adept at contacting their elected officials or bureaucrats, whether in person or in writing. But these studies that detect these civic skills, they also suggest that Russian citizens rarely apply these skills to other more collective forms of political participation, be it conventional political participation or contentious. And much of contemporary scholarship on political culture in Russia produces a common conclusion that I, to a certain extent, take issue with. So it links lack of civic and political participation to the socializing effects under the previous socialist regime that obviously disallowed independent political actions, and also to the scarcity of institutionalized avenues to participate. The scheme, in my opinion, produces two obvious flaws. First, it fails to account for the spike of political activism during last 5 years of the Soviet Union, in the end of, or sort of starting with Perestroika, and also it implicitly rules out the possibility of development of the democratic political culture in the future, embracing, intentionally or not, the idea of path dependence. So, and this trend actually is common in scholarship beyond Russia as well. So, for example, this scholarship on political culture often sees culture as very static and as an inheritance that produces political outcomes. If any of the scholarship beyond Russia, but in Russia too, so if any of it focuses on change, on the question of change in political culture, it draws, again, to me, some unsatisfying conclusions. So on the one hand, scholars of political culture often contradict each other or contradict themselves, sometimes even insisting that civic culture, civic mores, social capital, as they sometimes call it, it changes very quickly. And specifically, I have in mind here Robert Putnam's book on American political culture, Bowling Alone. On the other hand, Putnam himself also made an argument that political culture changes very slowly in his work on the democracy in Italy, how making democracy work on political culture in Italy. So this is one sort of flaw there. There seems to be contradictions. On the other hand, political culture is often examined through the lens of political institutions and policy outcomes that it supposedly produces. So for these scholars, often political culture is an explanatory variable rather than something that needs to be studied or explained on its own terms. So if we agree, and of course this is sort of a premise that maybe we do disagree on, but that's a different paper, maybe that's a different talk. So if we agree that a democratic political culture is necessary for accountable and competent democracy, the question is, how does it emerge? Where does it come from, this democratic political culture? First, of course, you might ask me, what do I mean by this democratic political culture? And here I turn to Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a forefather of scholarship on political culture, and that's why I find him useful, although as you'll see there are some criticisms or some limitations that I detect too. So he, of course, was a French aristocrat and social thinker, and most famous for his two books, Democracy in America and The Old Regime and the French Revolution. Tocqueville himself never visited Russia, although his work made it there pretty soon after its publication in the 19th century and made quite a splash. But Tocqueville knew enough about Russia. So he famously ended the first volume of Democracy in America with the juxtaposition of America and Russia, and in a sense anticipated the current rivalry between these two countries. So he wrote, "The American does battle with the obstacles that nature has placed before him. The Russian grapples with men. One combats wilderness and barbarity, the other civilization with all its arms. To achieve his goal, the American relies on personal interest and allows individuals to exercise their strength and reason without guidance. The Russian, in a sense, concentrates all the power of society in one man. The American's principal means of action is liberty, the Russians' servitude." And he continued, "The points of departure are different, their ways diverse, yet each seems called by a secret design of providence someday to sway the destinies of half the globe." So, but despite this comparison with which he ended his first book, it was, of course, not Russia that Tocqueville was comparing the United States to, but he was thinking about France, his native France. And the impetus of much of his work, Democracy in America, another work, was to understand what makes America democratic, free, stable, while post-revolutionary France, for the first half of the 19th century, as he thought, oscillated between despotism and tyranny. And one of the answers that Tocqueville pointed to was that the United States had a very vibrant culture of liberty, which post-revolutionary France utterly lacked. So what is this culture of liberty that Tocqueville observed in the United States, and where does it come from? What does he mean by democracy and by liberty? So I'll say a few words about that, but then I will bring my talk back to Russia. So in the realm of politics, democracy to Tocqueville means not how the polity is governed, but who constitutes it. So democratic societies, as opposed to aristocracies, for example, those where political rights and duties are equally distributed among all the individuals, where no one, as he wrote, was born with the privilege of legislative authority. But democracy also is a much broader term for Tocqueville. It's a much more comprehensive notion. It is just as salient, if not more so, outside of politics. Democracy is the equality of condition more generally, and the absence of privilege of birth more generally. And their effects manifest themselves and have consequences for all aspects of life, from economic activity to culture, from religion to manners, and of course politics and government included. So as Tocqueville conceptualized it, equality of condition has several inherent dangers, most acute of which are individualism and materialism. So individualism, as he put it, disposes each member of the community to sever himself from the mass of his fellow creatures and to draw apart with his family and his friends, so that after he has thus formed a little circle of his own, he willingly leaves society at large to itself. And being responsible only for themselves and their immediate private circle makes the democratic man believe that their success is not connected to the fates of those around them, of those outside of their primary group. They owe nothing to any man, they expect nothing of any man. And therefore, modern individualism, as described by Tocqueville, refers to democracy's central thrust toward civil apathy and toward withdrawal, which in political sphere translates into a voluntary abdication of citizenship, the loss of a will to power and to participate. So that is one of the outcomes for the political, consequences for the political sphere. The love of material well-being, or materialism, while a separate trait in democratic societies, produces similar effects as well. So equality of condition generates an intense focus on economic success, Tocqueville wrote, because in societies where no one is born into privilege that cannot be legally overcome, no one is expected to be satisfied with less than any fellow citizen has. And therefore, such drive for economic egalitarianism steers citizens toward political self-expropriation. So as he put it, in their intense anxiety to make a fortune, they lose sight of the close connection that exists between the private fortune of each and the prosperity of all. The better to look after what they call their own business, they neglect their chief business, which is to remain their own masters. And as I already mentioned, the main consequence the main consequence of this already mentioned abdication of citizens' political power is the rise of the centralized state administration. In other words, of a new democratic despotism, which Tocqueville thought was happening in France in his lifetime. So the opposite of this despotism is liberty, Tocqueville's notion that deals with the how of governing. He construes political liberty as the ability of the political community to practice republican self-government, as a political culture in which citizens take for granted the idea of rights and the practice of asserting them against the invasion of the state. So interestingly here, if democracy results in individualism, a certain degree of collectivism is necessary, is imperative for liberty. As he put it, so wrong it is to confound independence with liberty. No one is less independent than a citizen of a free state. And this is very frequently a mistake that Americans make, to sort of think of liberty as independence, or as being independent of something, of others. So while the democratic men stand apart, the free men need to act together, according to Tocqueville. So liberty is a collective endeavor. There are three sets of factors that explain the stability of American democracy, of American democratic republic. So these factors are, first, geographic, economic, and military circumstances of the country. It's a large territory. The Americans didn't need to fight with anybody, and he sort of brackets the Native Americans, of course. Secondly, the laws and institutions of the country, such as vertical and horizontal separation of powers. And thirdly, as he puts it, the subjective dispositions of Americans, or habits of the heart, customs, norms, practices, political culture, essentially. So it was not only the design of the American political system, the Constitution, the separation of powers, the decentralized federation that prevent democracy rise in America, according to him, but much more so the whole moral and intellectual condition of the American people, political culture. So he wrote, political societies are not what their laws make them, but what they are prepared to be in advance by the sentiments, beliefs, ideas, habits of the heart, and human spirit composing them. In short, institutions of laws and laws of free societies depend on the pre-existing and much more important culture of liberty. That is the conclusion that he draws. And that is what sort of, in my opinion, is frequently absent in understanding, or was absent in the literature and studies, scholarship on the sort of transitions of many, not only Russia, but many post-socialist countries to democracy. Sort of this imposition of institutions rather than understanding how to create culture. So what political culture? So what is this political culture is more specifically? What does it entail and where it comes from, right? That's the question. So the most important practice that Tocqueville points to is the Americans' impulse to constantly form associations, sort of reknitting the social fabric of democratic societies that is loosened by the equality of condition. So, and this is driven by the Americans' understanding that collective self-help serves their own individual interests. And Tocqueville calls it self-interest rightly understood. Or to put it differently, it is the recognition that they share common interests with their fellow citizens that propels Americans to participate voluntarily in self-government and, as we would call it now, in civil society. And this associational life serves not only to decentralize administrative and political power, controlling the rise of despotism, but also it enables ordinary citizens to attain a degree of positive freedom. And in America, this culture mostly comes from the Protestant Christianity, as it was brought from Britain by British Puritans to the New World. Once, of course, it's established, various religious, secular, and political associations reinforce and perpetuate this culture of civility and civic engagement. So religion is not as necessary anymore. But in Europe, on the other hand, the people, Tocqueville implied, have to be educated to the practice of freedom, and reforming customs and this bringing this democratic political or culture of democratic culture of liberty is itself a political task that might take decades. How exactly does this education happen? Who is in charge of this task? How do habits and mores of democratic liberty emerge? Except for some hints at cultured and virtuous elites and likely of aristocratic extraction as possible educators, Tocqueville himself did not provide any compelling and clear answers to this question. He did stress the importance of free participatory institutions like self-government, political groups, the press, and so on. But what if these institutions like this do not exist? In other words, where do the habits of freedom can be learned if the press, the local government, and other free associations are under the control of central powers? So for much of the 19th century, as you probably all know, and for some of the 20th, France oscillated between what Tocqueville called anarchy and despotism, and yet in the end it did develop a pretty robust culture of liberty. How do we account for this from a Tocquevillian perspective? And perhaps what is, of course, more important interest for us in this room probably, and for me including, of course, is Russia, which Tocqueville described so darkly in the end of the first volume of Democracy in America. Is Russia doomed to the eternity of servitude? So in this talk, I want to suggest that in the absence of free institutions in societies with a long history of centralized power, we need to look elsewhere for democratic political culture to emerge from. And one of such places is the barricades, or to speak less hyperbolically, the street protests and mass mobilizations. Tocqueville himself was not a huge fan, was not a fan at all of popular unrest, and in fact many of the rebellions and revolutions that took place in France in his lifetime, he actually thought were contributing to the anarchy and to despotism that he thought existed in France at that time. But of course, at that age, mass street actions were much more likely to turn, or at least they were perceived so, into uncontrollable violent rebellions than they are now, when mass protests have become a normal and quite peaceful part of the repertoire of modern social movements. Tocqueville's fear of popular uprisings was also likely compounded by the perception that such protests were led by politically inexperienced and uneducated leaders, not by the most intelligent and most moral classes of the nation, in other words, by the members of aristocracy, from which he himself came, of course. And therefore, he thought that only the aristocratic classes could guide and temper and educate the masses into liberty. And of course, this is a limitation, obvious limitation of his work. So in what follows, I will show that Tocquevillian mores of democratic liberty, habits and practices of self-government can emerge, or at least begin to emerge, not only through interactions of citizens within free institutions, like the Tocqueville observed in America, but also during street protests, as was happening in Russia in 2011-2012, which was the largest political mobilization there since the breakup of the Soviet Union. In short, my argument is that the street protests of that winter and spring were an expression of the budding culture of democratic liberty, and at the same time, I argue, these protests were the venue of formation and maturation of these habits and practices. And I use 4 examples to illustrate this thesis. Volunteering for the rallies, the development of the collective spirit and solidarity among the protesters, their absence, or their adherence to partisanship and coalition building, and independent electoral campaigns for local offices, and the coordinating council of the opposition that happened after the protests subsided. So this is a very, just as a reminder for you, timeline of the protests. They started the day after the parliamentary election on December 4th on 2011, and there were several really mass demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of people came out in Moscow, but also in other places in Russia to protest what was seen as a stolen election, and to try to ensure that the presidential election scheduled for March of 2012 would be much less, would not be fraudulent. So in March 2012, Putin was elected again president with 63% of the vote, and there were some reports about irregularities during that election as well, although they were much less seen as so. And actually in Moscow, he didn't even win plurality of the vote. And so the activity, the protest activity subsided over the summer, although not until a few people were arrested, and actually there were trials for years after that, arrested the day before Putin's inauguration. So this is just a sort of timeline of the protest, and I can talk about my methodology if anybody is interested in Q&A, but it's mostly, I wasn't in Moscow or in Russia at that time, and I mostly rely on a variety of secondary sources, which I can tell you more about. So now to my illustrations. Firstly, so I think that the very big change that happened in Russia over the last 10 or 15 years, to which the protests testified, was the decline of focus on purely personal materialistic pursuits, or of individualism and quest for material well-being in Tocqueville's terms. In the early 2000s, volunteering and charity were viewed with much suspicion. But the protest became a real triumph of voluntary, uncompensated activity. As one of the rally participants articulated it, lack of interest in politics has ceased to be grounds for pride, and instead, there were at least three sort of analytical examples how it happened. So firstly, there were, of course, thousands of those election observers who volunteered their time, spent hours being trained to be observers, and then spent a whole day on the election day making sure that elections were going to be as fair as officials were promising, and to do everything to ensure that they were, if the system was indeed rigged, as the opposition leaders were claiming. And the election observers were the ones to expose the scope of the electoral fraud, of course, but importantly, they were among the early and very enthusiastic participants in the first rallies. And so the picture on your right is a popular meme of the time. So on top, there's a line, 1990, line to McDonald's, the first McDonald's that opened in Moscow. In the middle, 2009, it's not even a line, it's a crowd of people trying to get into a first H&M store, again in Moscow. And on the bottom, 2012, it's a line to be registered as an election observer. So that was a very popular meme at the time. Then, of course, the protests themselves needed a lot of volunteers, organizers, and of course, participants of the rallies, all of whom spent some time being there on the streets, but also preparing, sometimes very seriously, organizing, mobilizing each other, friends, relatives, making very creative signs to bring with them. So that was a lot of time and effort. But also, I want to mention volunteer marshals at the rallies, who already at the second mass demonstration were out there in very large numbers. And they handed out flyers, they handed out white ribbons and buttons, the symbol of clean election, fair election. They collected trash, counted rally participants, signed up future election observers, and so on. And it is very important to remember that no single organization, not even a group of organizations like a political party or trade union, actually organized or mobilized people for the protest. Only about 10% of all rally participants said that they belonged to political organization of any kind. And like most participants in the rallies, the volunteers were also self-organized through internet communities. And if one were to add up all the time the election observers, the organizers, and participants and other volunteers spent, it will add up to millions, not to millions, but to tens of millions of man hours during that 5 or 6 months period. And there also were, of course, issues of financing the rallies. Sound systems, porta potties, stage, other amenities, they had to be paid for, and between December and March, the organizers through Yandex Dengi collected the equivalent of $300,000 US in very small donations, mostly $5 to $10. So you can make your math and see how many people contributed to that. So if in the first decade of the century, Russians were mostly interested in making a living and enjoying their earnings, now, as one observer put it, many rejected the social contract of the 2000s, which rested on the authorities granting their subjects personal freedom in the areas of self-expression and money-making in exchange for their non-interference in the political realm. Or to use Tocqueville's terms, no longer the discharge of political duties appears to them to be a troublesome impediment, which diverts them from their occupation and business, and they now understand, participants of these rallies, understand the connection between the private fortune of each and the prosperity of all. So not only many Russian voters donated time and money for the protests, but they also were no longer reluctant to express their protest publicly and visibly and collectively. So for the older Russians, even of my generation, showing membership in a civic or political group by wearing the organization's colors or buttons might be even more difficult than actually participating in a collective activity. And that's in the reaction formation to the collectivism of the Soviet days, obviously. But in the wake of 2011 parliamentary elections, the sentiment changed at least a little bit, at least for the many thousands of people who quickly adopted the new symbol of the movement for fair elections, the white button or the white ribbon more often. And they wore it not only to the protest, but every day, to work, on the subway, to the stores, to school, etc. So until recently, such public expression of membership was taken as a sign of groupthink, and it was expected mostly from staunch political activists, and often activists of a radical stripe, socialists, communists, or nationalists, for example. For many of the participants of the rallies, it wasn't very easy to join the protest, to be in the crowd, as they often admitted to journalists or in their own sort of blogs, for example. But once this discomfort was overcome, many of them gleefully commented on the sense of solidarity and community that they felt at the protests. One for all and all for one, a chant that, and that's also a reference to one of the movies, the Three Musketeer movies of the Soviet, very famous, very loved movie of the 1979, maybe? So, but there was also a chant at one of the first rallies, and now this was a profoundly felt sentiment that participants described to journalists and scholars, social scientists who were studying them. And probably was most evocatively illustrated by a participant of the big white ring flash mob in the end of February of 2011. And these are pictures from that flash mob that essentially sort of encircled the Kremlin. So she wrote, "It is an unforgettable feeling. We're standing on the sidewalk shoulder to shoulder, and all the cars on the road are honking, and people in them are shouting to us, 'We're with you.' They waved white ribbons at us, not only from cars, but from trolleybuses too. And from cars without any white ribbons, they also shouted, 'We're with you.'" And as one Russian publication summarized, the psychological barriers have moved. The fear of collectivity has disappeared. Maybe it's a very general conclusion, but I think we can definitely see it in some of the, even some of the photographs here. So not only general indifference is not a public virtue anymore, but many Russians, at least those who came out to the rallies, to put it again in Tocqueville's language, do not any longer hold a habit of considering themselves as standing alone, and sometimes literally not standing alone. So in the same self-conscious way that both organizers and participants of these protests underscored and enforced the movement's peaceful and self-limiting character, they also, for the most part, remained, and this is quite unusual for Russian oppositional politics, they remained non-partisan and therefore unified. So already for the very first rally, Alexei Navalny, one of the most popular opposition activists then, and especially now, he called for unity when he wrote on his blog, "It doesn't matter who's organizing the rally. Everyone has to come out to protest. Nationalists, liberals, leftists, Greens, vegetarians, Martians, everyone had their votes stolen." And simultaneously, very early on in the process, Russian online communities began to discuss and plan scenarios of expression of their civic position, framing it not in terms of political opposition, but of a common cause. We're not in opposition. We're the people, announced one of the best received speakers at the, I think it was first very large rally on December 24th. To a large extent, it was, this trend was due to the newcomers to the political protest, to the movement, who they comprised a very vast majority of the rally participants, and they were the ones to prevent the movement from deteriorating into factionalism and being hijacked by a group of one political stripe or another. Interestingly, organizing of the protest, especially in the early days, was marked by a very animated debate whether to include Russian nationalist groups in the planning of the rallies, and also whether to give them space to speak during the rallies. Already, again, very early in the cycle, groups of nationalists, environmentalists, and anti-fascists, otherwise a very explosive mix, they marched together through the city, chanting in unison, "Россия без Путина," Russia without Putin. Yet, of course, there were some skeptics and opponents to the inclusion of nationalists, but the majority, in the end, decided to compromise and to include them and give them space to speak. And no doubt it was done to preserve the image of the movement as being beyond ideology, to demonstrate that the demands for fair elections were something that groups from different ends of the political spectrum could agree on. A small splinter group that was unhappy with such an alliance with the nationalists attempted to organize a separate rally on February 4th, but no more than 200 people showed up to that one, while elsewhere in Moscow, close to 100,000 people marched alongside nationalist groups. And this is a picture from that rally on February 4th. So the coordinators of this large rally on February 4th, by the way, they agreed to march in formations organized by political ideologies: liberals, nationalists, and socialists. These are sort of three broad ones. However, at the head of the march, they were going to place the so-called Civic Alliance. And so this picture actually, I don't know whether in the back you can see that, but in the back of the picture you can see different color flags of these different groups, different ideological groups, while the vast majority here in the front at least are holding either Russian flags or white symbols, white ribbons, white flags, again the general symbol of the free election. So explaining this decision to have ideological or party formations, moderators of one of the protest mobilization hubs on Facebook wrote that such format would actually be good for preserving unity and tolerance. First, they said putting the Civic Alliance at the head of the march would prevent radicals or ideologues of any stripe from taking the lead, from sort of hijacking the march. They would have to be sort of toward the back. Secondly, the division by political ideology would demonstrate that the overwhelming majority, and we can maybe see it from this picture too, did not belong to any of the political organization that didn't share any of those political ideologies. Though again, it was sort of anti-ideological and more sort of unifying. And lastly, the moderators reminded the readers that one of the goals of the march, and by extension of the whole protest movement, was to ensure the widest possible spectrum of political forces in the new Russia, and to guarantee that the relationship among these parties was based on competition, but also on mutual respect. We are all practicing mutual tolerance, even if we don't like each other, they wrote. So of course, leaders of different political groups that participated in these rallies admitted, and their constituents understood very well, that one day they will be competing against each other in the free and fair elections, or they might be. Their hope was, for sure. But for now, they were supporting each other and putting their ideological differences aside to ensure that such election actually happened. And as Tocqueville put it almost 200 years ago, the desire of being elected leads all men in the long run to support each other. And if it happens that an election accidentally severs two friends, the electoral system brings a multitude of citizens permanently together who would otherwise always have remained unknown to one another. And this brings me to my last illustration. When mass protests subsided, demands for fair elections did not stop. They took different form, consistent with the exercise of the Tocquevillian customs of democratic liberty. So as if they heard Tocqueville say town meetings are to liberty what primary schools are to science, they bring it within the people's reach, they teach them how to use and how to enjoy it. Quite a few protesters ran in municipal elections as anti-establishment candidates in the spring of 2012, but also since then, after that. And this was, in 2012, it was particularly true in Moscow, where there were twice as many candidates than previously running for these elections, and opposition candidates either sort of running as independents or as representatives of oppositional parties. They won about 1/3 of all municipal seats in Moscow, which is more than 3 times that they got in 2008, the previous election. And many of them ran for offices and have been participating in other local campaigns and initiatives since 2012, desiring specifically to extend the experience of collective action of the protests, as they themselves admit. But it is another election that is particularly worth mentioning in this context: the election to the opposition's coordinating council, which took place in the end of October 2012. So this election was unique in several respects. First of all, an entirely independent and transparent electoral system was set up for this election, and much of it was coordinated online, and all the results, procedures, financing, and all the relevant information were made available for everybody to scrutinize. The election was preceded by a two-month-long campaign, during which over 200 candidates for this 45-seat body registered, and they debated each other in several rounds of televised debates, after each of which viewers ranked the candidate based on their performance. Russian citizens who wanted to participate to vote in the election had to register and to get verified prior to casting their ballots. And both of the stages and the voting itself actually required quite a bit of perseverance on the part of citizens because they required several steps were involved and technology too, and not every Russian, especially again of older generation, is very familiar with technology. My mom actually went through 2 of the stages but never reached the 3rd one because it did get too complicated for her, even though she sort of handles internet quite well for her age. So the voting, which was supposed to take place entirely online with only a few backup physical polling places, actually was nearly sabotaged by cyber attacks, and also had to take it had to get offline essentially. Despite all of these obstacles, 130,000 Russian citizens registered to vote. Close to 100,000 got verified, and 80,000 voted in the election. So it was not a political forum or party congress that elected this coordinating committee, but Russian citizens who chose to participate in voting. When the coordinating council met, of course, some of its members exhibited personal ambition, ideological differences, and certain lack of trust, but they were nonetheless attempting to ensure coordination of the opposition's disparate parts. And again, in itself, this was a big and important development. The council was elected for 1-year term. It met several times. Its proceedings were streamed online for everybody who wanted to watch. The first joint statement of the Council condemned the government's repressions and alleged torture of opposition activists. Again, something that sort of all of them were concerned about. I have to say that last several meetings of the Council in the summer and fall of 2013 lacked from, or suffered from very low member turnout and lacked quorum to take any meaningful votes. And its term ended in October 2013 without new council or new elections being scheduled. However, what this election testifies to most of all is the ability of some Russian citizens to self-organize for political causes and the growth of growing trust, not necessarily grown yet, but growing trust among them. So by no means the protest movement that surfaced in 2011 was the first expression of the awakening of the civil society in Russia in recent years. Many of the protesters, people who participated there, while they were absolutely new to political activity, had experience in volunteering at orphanages with local ecological initiatives or in their neighborhood activism, for example. But these protests were the most public, massive, and collective demonstration of civic engagement, a surprise to the authorities, to previously very small groups of opposition activists, and to the protesters themselves, actually. Furthermore, the protests not only brought the discontent of thousands of Russian citizens out in the open, but clearly and specifically focused it on the political sphere and on the existing political system of hyper-presidentialism, rather than on individual leaders, politicians, and bureaucrats, as many previous protests had done. So, of course, I do not want to exaggerate the strength, the breadth, the depth of these democratic mores that, as I have shown, were developing in the protests. I do think that more empirical studies need to be conducted to gauge the changes in trust among Russian citizens, to ascertain continuation of their commitment to various civic and political collective initiatives, and try to estimate what portion of the population and what sectors, sort of in terms of socio-demographic characteristics, did in fact pick up and retain these habits of self-government and associationalism. The intent of my paper was not to suggest that every Russian, or even many, has in the last few years acquired the culture of democratic liberty, but my main goal is to explore its origins in societies without free institutions, and to argue that street protests can serve as substitutes for such venues. So how does it happen exactly? What maybe, sort of, to put it maybe in political science terms, also sociological terms, what are the mechanisms maybe? Although, and I'm concluding here. So how does this happen? Tocqueville's discussion of American free institutions and voluntary associations can direct us to a possible answer. So the very participation in these free institutions, he says, fosters public spirit and awareness of mutual dependence, makes private practices and ideas public, produces lasting ties among people, and reminds people they live in a society and not alone. So the very facts that we can see emerge also from the street actions in Russia. One can argue, following symbolic interactionism, which is an influential school of American sociology, that culture of democratic liberty, like culture in general, is what people do. Symbolic interactionists have defined culture as products of social action that in turn may be drawn upon in the future conduct of social life. In other words, political culture, we can argue, changes through everyday interactions of participants acting for political purposes, either during daily services on civic committees or at street protests. The Russian protest rallies, and of course later to the Occupy-style street camps, they created something similar to a barricade sociability, when the pragmatic practices of building barriers, guarding streets, or huddling together generate social relations that turn strangers into comrades, and do so primarily through pragmatic practice rather than political rhetoric. Furthermore, the street mobilization can also create new public spaces for open and independent communication about politics. As one sociologist concluded, more and more people were coming out to the protests not to demonstrate that they're against something, they're against Putin or against something else, but to meet and interact with each other as members of a newly established communicative community. And also an important communicative function was performed by online media, like personal blogs and social networking sites. They have proven to be not only effective means for organizing, but also tools of critical thinking and self-therapy throughout the entire period of street protests and in its aftermath. Tocqueville wrote about the importance of mass media. In his age, of course, it was newspapers, the importance for cooperation with fellow citizens for a common purpose. When television is controlled by the state and the print and even online professional media are struggling financially, the new media not only connect many of their users for common activity, but have another benefit of an interactive do-it-yourself quality that makes otherwise passive consumers of news and opinion into their producers. And that, I think, sort of dovetails very well with what some of you were presenting on the Friday of my first week here during that one-day workshop, which was very illuminating, actually. And collective critical deliberation is facilitated by the blogs and social media's comment section or comment option, when some posts collected hundreds of responses, often in dialogue with each other as much as they were with the original post, for example. As much as social media might enable narcissism under certain circumstances or produce fake news, as we very recently learned, they also have the capacity to create a publicish sphere, not quite necessarily public, but kind of publicish sphere that is integrated into everyday life of millions of people and to support the formation of a counter-public. So to conclude, mass mobilizations like the one that I talked about might seem unproductive and pointless, as some Russian analysts and even participants of them have implied frequently, but they do often serve as a stand-ins for free institutions, facilitate associationalism, and create new communicative spaces in polities that are otherwise under the control of centralized administrations. Thank you very much. I look forward to your feedback.